We are here today to honor Isabel Allende, author and human rights activist. Ms. Allende has just been named to the 1994 Marin Women's Hall of Fame. Congratulations, Ms. Allende.
Thank you.
How did you feel when you realized you had been named to the Hall of Fame?
I felt for the first time that I belong in a place, that I belong in a community. I have been a foreigner for very long. And when I moved to Marin County, it took me a long time to adapt and to feel that I had a home here. And this was like a very important thing in my life.
It was many years ago that you had to leave your real home, is that correct? Can you tell us what that was like when your uncle was deposed in Chile?
There was a military coup in 1973. After 3 years of socialist government, the president at the time was Salvador Allende, my uncle. And after the military coup, my family had to leave. Well, those who were still alive or free, because many were in prison. And after some time, I left too with my husband and my children, and we went to Venezuela, always thinking that we would go back very soon. So for many years, we were just looking south. And it took me a while to understand that the military coup was there to stay for a long time. I made a living with all sorts of odd jobs in the meantime, and it was a hard time in my life, a time of emotional paralysis, I would say. And then finally, in 1981, I started writing, and I think that that changed my life completely. I found a way of bringing all these stories out, of connecting myself to my dream world and to the world and to other people. It gave a sense to my life, a meaning.
You had written before 1981, though, isn't that correct, while you were still in Chile? Is that right, in Caracas? Had you worked, was it for a newspaper or for television?
I was a journalist. I had been a journalist since I was very young. And I worked in all sorts of media, television, children's magazines, women's magazines, everything except radio. And every subject except politics and sports. I did horoscopes, I did kitchen recipes, I did love columns, I did interviews, everything. And I loved it. I would have been a journalist for the rest of my life without the military coup.
What was it like to be a journalist during that time after the military coup?
It was practically impossible because there was censorship and self-censorship. And that made my work practically impossible because censorship means that you only can publish certain themes. And self-censorship means that even within those themes, you have to be extremely careful. Because even after this thing is published, they can object, and then you can go to jail for that.
So were you ever afraid to write what you really wanted to write?
Yes, I was afraid, but also it was not permitted. So even if I wanted to, even if I would have dared to, I could not publish.
Then in Venezuela, you were allowed to do the writings that you wanted to do, is that correct?
I was allowed, but in theory. That is, there was no censorship in Venezuela. It was a democracy that really functioned. But I could not find a job as a journalist. You know, when you leave your country, at least in Latin America, that's the case, your resume or your curriculum is not important. No one reads it. You need connections, you need friends, you need relationships. And that's the way you move around in the society. And I did not have the connections. So when I got to Venezuela, I did all sorts of odd jobs.
What did you do?
Oh, everything. And I ended up, after many years, I ended up in a school, administering a school. I can't add. So I don't know how we managed, really.
You did?
Yeah.
Do you think it was difficult growing up as a girl in South America, more difficult than growing up as a boy in South America, to do what you wanted to do, to try to achieve what you wanted to achieve?
I think that was the case when I was young. It is still the case, and I think that that's the case all over the world still. Things have changed for some group of educated women in urban areas in industrialized countries, but those are very privileged groups. Most of the world has not yet heard of women's leap.
You said you had always been a feminist. I think I read something that you wrote. When do you think that started? Just from the time you were a little girl without even realizing what feminism was? Or
There was no word to name the anger I felt when I was little. When I was around 5, I think I became aware of the fact that my mother was a victim in a household of males, where my grandfather was a very powerful patriarch, second only to God Almighty. And the men in the family had all the freedom and the privileges and the rights, and the women had no education, no power, and they were therefore in a very vulnerable position, and I did not want to be there. I wanted to be like my brothers, like my uncles, like my grandfather. Unfortunately, although I achieved that for some years when I was little, I was a tomboy. Later, nature betrayed me, and something started protruding here.
that does happen. What does happen?
And I realized that I would have to fight very much, to struggle all my life in order to do those things that I wanted to do, because I was a woman in a male-oriented society.
Many of your characters, I understand, have been modeled after people you know or you knew, and many have been members of your family. And I believe your father, who left you and your mother at a very early age, was the model for, was it the Count de Satigny? I'm not saying that right. Pronounce
the Count de Satigny, yes.
In the water?
In this book, in the House of the Spirits.
In the House of the Spirits, I mean. And how did that come to be? How did you deal with the fact that you really never knew your father but were able to model this?
Well, when my father left, my mother destroyed all his photographs, and she never talked about him. So when we, the children, asked about our father, we were always told that he was a very intelligent man, nothing else. And I grew up with this tremendous curiosity about my father, and attributing to that image, that blurred image that I had of him, all the perversities and all the glamour that I thought he might have. I asked myself, why did he leave? Why did he disappear? Why nobody talks about him? He must have done something horrible. And then later in my life, when I grew up and I learned about sexual perversion, for example, I thought that he had all that. I thought that he was a drug dealer, that he had murdered people, that he had cheated. I don't know what I thought in my imagination. And many years later, when I wrote The House of the Spirits, I was nearly 40 when I wrote the book, I had this character, the Count de Satigny, in the book, and I gave the Count all those fantasies that I had about my father.
The character certainly has
a lot.
A lot.
And then when my mother read the manuscript, she got very angry, because she said, how could you talk about your father like that? So maybe I wasn't so far away from the truth. Maybe there was part of that in my father, and my mother finally admitted it.
Did you find that odd that she would get angry since he left her with children?
Because for my mother, appearances were very important. She wouldn't like anybody of the family, not even my father, to be pointed out with a finger and in any way. I mean, she would defend the family name.
And yet, despite the feelings you have about the male-dominated household and how difficult it was for girls and women in those kinds of households, you have not grown up with a hatred of men. Here you are, married again.
I've always had a man in my life. That's really weird. I don't know how it has happened.
But it hasn't caused you to be so absolutely bitter about men.
No, because I don't blame men for this situation. I think we are both to blame, men and women. Women raise children. We form children at a very early age. We could change the world in one generation if we decided to. But in many ways, women perpetuate the male-oriented traditions and the culture. So I think that we are to blame too, and we both together, men and women, can make real changes. And I have never thought of feminism as a war against men, but as something that we have to learn together to improve life in this planet. And that's the way I try to raise my children. I have a son who's 27, and he's the best mother that I've ever seen. He's a wonderful housewife. he's the wife I would like to have.
And you probably are much credited for that. I mean, I think
Absolutely, totally credited. What are you talking about? My former husband was not responsible for that because he was brought up in the old traditional way. It was me who had the feminist insight into the education of the kids.
And yet when you were asked about role models growing up, I noted that you wrote that your grandfather was one of your role models. Why was he one of your role models, and were most of the other role models women?
He was a role model because he was the father figure in my life, and he taught me about discipline, independence, strength. I know in my life that no one will give me anything. Everything that I have or that I achieve will be done by my own effort, and that was my grandfather's lesson. And I've always been grateful for that because I've seen how many women fall automatically into a passive role, into a sort of victim role, because they don't go out there and fight for themselves. And watching my grandfather, I think that I learned that. If I would have followed my mother's model, I would be a victim today.
So in other words, your grandfather, even though you were a girl, you are a girl and now a woman, wanted you to be independent.
He didn't want me to. I just grabbed it. Yeah. I think that he wanted me to be a nice lady with good table manners, educated, polite. I should speak French.
I see. We should all speak French.
Yeah.
When you talked about the most difficult obstacles in your life, and perhaps in many women's lives, you talked about low self-esteem and the rigid cultural and social structures of the society where you grew up. And we've talked about that a little, but do you think those are still problems for young women, for girls today?
Yes, especially, I would say, in this country, among the Latin community. In the Latin community, we still have many of the traditions from our countries, and you will see many fathers who will send their boys to school and struggle to have them go to college and, if possible, to the university. However, they will stop the girls from that because it's not promoted that girls should have a higher education. It's not necessary. They think it's not necessary. The young generations are doing it in spite of their brothers, their fathers, their fiancés, because usually the men in their life stop them. So I think it's still present in our society, very much so.
If you had a message for young Latinas, for the girls, what would you tell them in that regard?
To have a knife in their teeth and go out there and fight for themselves, because no one is going to give them anything. They will have to get it. And maybe this is the message for every woman, not only the young Latinas.
One of the reasons you were nominated and named to the Women's Hall of Fame is because of your service to the community. And you mentioned at the beginning of this interview that you finally feel a part of this community in a much bigger way than you ever had. You are very involved as an advocate for women and children. What kinds of things have you felt good about doing once you've achieved some notoriety on your own and you don't have to struggle so much about where's the next job coming from or where's the next meal coming from? What are some of the things that have brought real joy to your heart that you've been able to do?
Every time that I can help somebody, even if it's in a very small scale, I feel okay. But most of the time I feel very guilty because I can't do enough. And there's so much to be done. Today I had the possibility of helping a woman who has 2 little babies, and she has to work. Her husband abandoned her. She has 2 babies and she has to work and she needs to do something with the kids. And she was leaving the kids with another woman who was beating them. And so I found a way of placing these kids for daycare in some place and finding the money to finance this. And I feel okay. And then I start thinking, gosh, these are just 2 kids. And in the canal area, there are probably thousands of kids who need the same thing, and I cannot provide for all of them. So it's a mixed blessing. On one hand, there's some few things that I can do, but there's so much that I can't. And I always feel that I should maybe go out there and mobilize people and talk to them and explain. And then I have other things to do also, and it's just
Well, you were
like a
very
drop of water.
That's right. You were very visible recently at City Hall in San Francisco in the effort against Proposition 187, the so-called Save the State initiative, which would deny various services such as schooling and health care to immigrant families. You seem the kind of person who likes to work quietly, one-on-one with the family you just described. Was that difficult for you to get out there and be a real visible person that day at City Hall?
Yes, I come from a political family, but I'm not a political animal. I'd feel very uncomfortable. However, the Latin community in California doesn't have very many people that can go out there and talk for them, speak for those who don't have a voice. And I felt that in this case, I really had to come forward and explain why Proposition 187 is fascist in essence and mean in spirit. And it creates a subclass of people who live in this country and have no education and no health. People who are suspects because they have another color in their skin, they are darker, or they have an accent, or their name is of Spanish origin. If you deny health care to the children, that means that these two babies I'm talking about, these two children that I'm trying to place in daycare, will not have the shots. They will get the measles, the chicken pox, all the diseases that have already been banned in this country, they will get them. And they will be contagious, therefore, and infect the rest of the population. Those children, unless somebody pays for their education in some private school, are not allowed to go to school. And so they will be in the streets, roaming in gangs. Is that what this country wants? A subclass like the third world countries have?
How did you feel when you were there that
Very
day?
angry and very moved. And when I was talking, I had my eyes full of tears, and I tried to control it because I realized I was making a fool of myself, that I was there to speak in a reasonable language to these supervisors, and I was there to tell them in a very pragmatic way how the community feels about this, and I just couldn't. I took it in a very emotional way, and I was on the verge of crying.
I'm going to steal some words from you. You wrote that there's an old saying that you like. Question, what is truer than truth? Answer, the story. Can you explain that, Isabel?
Yes, I can explain it with part of the conversation that we're having now. If I tell you that Proposition 187 is fascist, that doesn't mean anything. If I tell you that there is a woman up there who has two little babies who will not get the shots and will not have an education, that is the story, and it is truer than truth. The truth is that it is fascist, but truer than that statement is this woman and her two little babies.
Speaking of stories, your stories are pretty amazing stories. Did you ever think, and I'm looking at some of your books here, and the articles are not here. You have written so prolifically. Did you ever think you would be this successful?
No. Actually, when I wrote The House of the Spirits, I had no idea that I was writing a book. I thought I was writing a letter for my grandfather, and it later became a book. And then when it was a book, my mother said, let's have this thing published. And she got in touch with several publishers, and no one wanted to read it. It was too long. It was a dirty manuscript. Nobody knew me. I was a woman. And then my mother insisted that we had to find an agent. And finally, the book got published. And when it was published, it became an immediate success, the kind of success story that all authors hope for. And it never happens in real life. So it was a very big surprise for everybody involved, for us as a family, for me as an author, for my agent, and for the publishers. So this thing has been like growing like an avalanche, and I can't stop it now. And I'm very pleased that it has happened this way, because it gives me a platform where I can stand and be more effective in my work in the community, in my work as a communicator, in my job as a feminist. And it also allows me to make a living in something that I love. There's nothing that I love more than storytelling. Well, yeah, there is one thing. Two things.
Do you want to tell us?
Well, making love and frozen yogurt.
That's pretty good. It sounds like something from someone who writes these wonderful books. Were all the characters in House of the Spirits people you knew or know?
Most of them were. And most of them in the House of the Spirits were members of my family. Actually, when the book was published, many of my relatives would not speak to me. Later, when they started reading the reviews and they saw how successful the book was, they started playing the roles. And now that the movie's out there, they think that Meryl Streep and Jeremy Irons are our grandparents, really. So their photographs may be on several pianos in my family.
I'm going to ask this for girls who might want to grow up to be writers, and you struggled for many years. How difficult is it when you sit down to start, for instance, this is your new book? How difficult is that? You're a wonderful storyteller, but do you just start telling stories, or how difficult is it?
I think that writing, to be an author as a profession, it's like being an athlete. You have to train every day. Some people think that one day they will sit down and write the great American novel out of pure inspiration and good luck. This is hard job. This is discipline. This is 8 hours a day. There is more work than inspiration, and we have to train to do it. Language is the only tool that an author has. You have to learn to use language in the most effective and beautiful way, because only if it's beautiful it is effective. You have to know how to do that, because it's not only the storytelling, it's the craft of putting it in words, in a paper, and that's hard work. So what I would tell them is just do it every day and think of it in a very serious way.
You do it every day, and yet you have a life. I guess physically I'm asking you, do you just sit down and write for a certain part of the day?
Yes, I get up very early in the morning. I commute to my studio where I light a candle when I get there, and I stay quiet for a few seconds or minutes to cut myself away from the noise of the world, and then I light my candle. People think that it's superstition, that the candle means something. The candle is like my clock, but it's much nicer than an alarm clock. For as long as the candle is burning, and that's 6 to 7 hours, I write. And that is my sacred time, my private time of silence and solitude, and that's my creative time. The rest of the day is interviews, contracts, press, fan letters, and all the noise of the world. And then in the evening, the family. I have an extended family, a Latin tribe, so we have to cook for a lot of people.
Cool. So you and your husband, and you mentioned that your greatest joy is your grandchildren.
I have my daughter-in-law and my son and 3 grandchildren and a stepson and his girlfriend, and a very good friend who's like a sister and her son, and it's like 10 people.
And your
dinner.
husband?
Well, my husband and I cook, so we are the ones who are in charge of the work. But we don't do the dishes, though. Everybody else does them.
Is he very supportive of you?
Yeah. It's amazing because he's a white American lawyer, and he has been able to adapt to this Latin tribe. And we have been able to combine both things. So in my house, you hear this language that is like Spanglish, that it's a mixture of English and Spanish. We cook Mexican food and hamburgers. There's the noise of the rock and roll that my stepson is playing, and the Latin music that my daughter-in-law is playing in another room. So it's a mixture of textures and flavors and colors, and he has adapted very well. Sometimes, though, he says, okay, enough is enough, we need some privacy. And so we just retire for a few days to some place where we can be alone.
In The Infinite Plan, which I have not read yet, it's your newest book, the women in there, are they also all very strong characters? And did you also model them around people you knew? I know early on we talked about somebody right here from Marin County who you modeled one character after.
And actually, she's someone who deserves to be in the Hall of Fame much more than I do.
Oh, you definitely deserve to be in
No,
there.
she does. She's an activist. She's very much involved with refugees from all over the world. The character in this book is called Carmen Morales at the beginning of the book. And she's just a young girl who grows up to be a very famous jeweler. And she changes her name and becomes very, very famous, and she sells her jewelry all over the world. And this really happened. The name of this person in real life is Tabra. And she makes these earrings and this belt and all this jewelry. And she's like my sister, really. And she started her life selling jewelry in Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley.
A street vendor.
A street vendor for 7 years, living in a beaten-up Cadillac that she couldn't move because it didn't have an engine. That was her home, and there she made her jewelry, and she sold it in the street. And now she has a shop in Novato, and she has hired 100 people that work for her. And she has been awarded several awards in the last years because the working conditions in her shop are perfect, not only for women, but in every sense they are. She's the most honest, hardworking, socially responsible person I know.
Do more of us need to be socially responsible, Isabel? Do you think there are too many people who shy away from it?
Yeah, we are afraid of the word, and we are also afraid of the word feminist. We're afraid of the word politically correct. Why? I mean, I think that if more and more people get involved, are concerned, get together, speak about these things, we can really make a change. We can make a change in our block, in our community, in our city, in our country, in the world. And if we don't get involved, the change will never come. Because we have the power, we have education, we have the means. We are here sitting together talking on TV. And that's a very powerful thing that we have. So we have the responsibility.